Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. We hope you had an excellent, if unusual, Thanksgiving holiday, and want to wish you right up front a happy and healthy Hanukkah, and then a Merry Christmas, because we have slightly different plans for the remainder of the month. We'll be in touch. You'll be hearing from us. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. We have a very large audience today, and I know many of you are here because you've read and heard today's guest, Michael Pregent of the Hudson Institute. Before we get to Michael, here is your JPC commercial. We were established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, our magazine In Focus Quarterly, our blog In Context, you can see our pattern, or you can read our Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense blogs. Outside the pattern, but lots of good information. We support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, we've been pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China in various permutations, Israel issues, including but not only the Abraham Accords, Iran sanctions, the sort of rolling rebellion in Iran, and a side trip to the US Supreme Court. Today, we're going to be slightly esoteric. We are going to be talking about why the United States finds itself involved in what are commonly called forever wars and how we might unwind that, if in fact we can. Now, your public service announcement, you are muted. You can send your questions, however, by using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. No more questions to info, questions only on the Q&A screen, please. We're monitoring them during the program. And now for our program. I've actually been interested for some time in how military people view long-term wars, not long-term alliances like NATO, and what would constitute a victory in a long-term war and a reason to leave, or alternatively, a reason to leave. I think our guest today, Michael Pregent, will take us into what happens in forever wars. Mike Pregent is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He is a senior Middle East analyst, former adjunct lecturer at the College of International Security Affairs, and a visiting fellow at the National Defense University. That, I think, is not the most interesting part. He is also a former intelligence officer with over 28 years experience working security, terrorism, and counterinsurgency and policy issues in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southwest Asia. He has spent considerable time working against the malign Iranian influence in Iraq as an advisor to Iraq's security and intelligence apparatus. Mike served as an embedded advisor with the Peshmerga in Mosul from 2007 to 11. As a civilian working for the DIA, he was a political and military advisor, focusing on reconciliation, the insurgency, and Iranian influence in Iraq. He was a violent extremism and foreign fighter analyst at CENTCOM from 2011 to 2013. Academically, he holds a master's degree in strategic public relations from George Washington University. He is also a graduate of the U.S. Army's Defense Language Institute in Modern Standard Arabic and Egyptian dialect. It's always surprised me how few of our area specialists studied the language in which the area functions. Mike does that. He has numerous publications on ISIS, Iran's Quds Force, and on Syria and Iraq. He's been published everywhere you would think he would be: Foreign Affairs, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, Business Insider, and Daily Beast, among others. He frequently appears on the BBC World News, Al Jazeera International, CNN, and Fox News. And now he is appearing with the Jewish Policy Center. Michael Pregent, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be able to talk about something that I'm very interested in. And my interest started in 1990 when I was introduced to this conflict as a young sergeant out of the 101st Airborne Division. But let's talk about where we are now and why we have forever wars. If you look at the 17 years that we've been in Iraq and the 19, almost 20 years we've been in Afghanistan, our policy has changed almost every year that we've been there. So instead of being in Iraq for 17 years, we've been in Iraq for 1 year 17 times, in Afghanistan for 1 year 19 times. And our adversaries have developed a playbook. So they've been introduced to the American advisor, and they broke them down into 5 categories. The American who is a solution-based, wants to be here, let's get this solved. And that's usually the first American they're introduced to at the beginning of a conflict. So in 2003, that American advisor was, the equivalent of a Lawrence of Arabia. Same thing in Afghanistan. By year 5, after 5 iterations of American advisors, the Iraqis and the Afghans, it would be 7 years for the Afghans, started to develop a playbook. This is the American who wants to be here. This is the good idea fairy. It's a military term for the person that, it's like Johnny come lately. Hey, why don't we try this? Something that was tried 4 years ago that didn't work. The I don't want to be here, the I can't wait to get home. And they realized that they could literally delay these wars to their advantage. And what I mean by that is the Iraqi sitting across from that American never changed. It's the same person in a lot of cases. So it's the equivalent of having somebody play chess with 17 different Americans and win every time, based on learning how we think. Americans want to be liked. So we go into these meetings thinking that, if you talk to somebody for 2 hours, you can change their minds. And this was the thinking of 4-star generals. I worked with General Petraeus and General Odierno. And when I'm on Fox or CNN, the Chiron says former intelligence advisor to General Petraeus and General Odierno. And they remember me because I was the intel guy that kept saying, hey, we need to pay attention to this because this is what's going to happen. And the reason they haven't told me to take that moniker or take that moniker away from me is because, I was right about some things. I'm not prescient. I just was looking at the facts and trying to be solution-based. And, with working with Petraeus, Odierno, General McMaster at the time was a colonel, we believed in them, and they believed that because we believed in them, that if they told the Iraqis something, or if the Iraqis told them something, it was the truth. And often that turned out not to be the case. The intelligence would say, we'd have a briefing to General Petraeus saying, sir, this is what Prime Minister Maliki is doing. And General Petraeus would say, no, that's not true, because we had dinner tonight and he said he's not doing that. And we'd be able to come out, well, here's the intelligence report after your dinner where he says this is what he's doing. And General Petraeus didn't like to hear that, but the best thing about General Petraeus is when he heard something, when he heard a fact get in the way of an assumption, he went in the right direction. So General Petraeus had a lot of success when he was in Iraq. So did General Odierno, and General Austin followed. And when General Austin followed, we saw the rise of ISIS, and we saw the rise of the Iranian militias. And now we're at the point, after 17 years in Iraq, where Iran's militias in Iraq are more of a threat than ISIS is, are more of a threat than Al-Qaeda ever was. And because of our lack of a consistent US foreign policy, we never really addressed their growth while we were watching all of these indicators that they would become something we would have to deal with. And I'll take you back to January 2nd, 2020. We had to deal with it. We targeted Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and his go-to guy in Iraq, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, the deputy commander of the popular mobilization units, which the Iraqis call the Hashd al-Shabi. And we had to take them out because they had just conducted a rehearsal on how to seize the US embassy in Baghdad. That was a rehearsal. And the chatter in Iraq was that they were going to try to seize the embassy, and trade American hostages for sanctions relief, meaning sanctions relief for Tehran based on President Trump walking out of the Iran deal, and it was the right thing to do, by the way. So, real quick, where we are now, the militias are more of a threat than ISIS. The US is now funding an Iraqi government that pays the militias tied to Tehran a salary, gives the militias tied to Iran US intelligence, gives these militias tied to Tehran US access to US equipment and access to US training. The militias in Iraq tied to Tehran now have primacy. The Prime Minister of Iraq, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, cannot push back against the new leader of Kitab Hezbollah, Abu Fadak. And there's a reason for that. It's because the militias actually agreed that Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi should be Prime Minister. Why do they agree to that? Well, Qasem Soleimani, Nasrallah, and Muqtada al-Sadr have always tried to decide who the Iraqi Prime Minister was going to be. After Qasem Soleimani was killed on January 2nd, 2019, or correction, 2020, his replacement, Ismail Qani, met with Nasrallah in Lebanon and Muqtada al-Sadr and decided that Mustafa al-Kadhimi would be the new Prime Minister of Iraq. That's why he hasn't done anything about the militias attacking the US Embassy. That's why a militia leader can surround his house and demand the release of militia members responsible for rocket attacks on the US Embassy. And our US footprint in Iraq is so small that we don't have the capability to action these targets ourselves. We have to rely on what we've called an ally. We have to rely on a government we've called a partner to do these things. And when you ask the Iraqi government who's responsible for the rocket attacks on the US Embassy or the rocket attacks that killed our American contractor, Narwez Hamid, December 27, 2019, their first response is ISIS remnants or former Baathists, not the militias that they just allowed control of that territory to conduct these attacks. So where we are in Iraq right now is a place where the United States does not have a winning strategy, does not have a partner, and our adversaries on the ground, militia members, have been told by Ismail Qani, the new leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, not to conduct attacks until the president leaves office, but to step up the pressure once Biden takes position. Tehran is telling the Iraqi militias, do not mess with President Trump. Do not mess with the United States until President Trump leaves office, and then we'll start stepping up the attacks. That should signal something to the Biden administration. One of the things we have to get back to is a consistent foreign policy where our adversaries, our geopolitical competitors, do not believe there are election outcomes that favor them. We need to get back to a place where both Democrats and Republicans view the Islamic Republic of Iran as a state sponsor of terror. We need to get back to a place where we view China as a problem. Both parties view China as a problem. We need to get back to a place where Democrats that are against Russia aren't simply against Russia on Twitter and Facebook, but against Russia in Crimea, in Syria, in the Ukraine. We need to get back to a place where our adversaries don't interfere in US elections because they believe there's an outcome that favors them. And I'll be honest with you, and I'll tell you that it's pretty sad. And the intelligence community's assessment can back me up that Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow are happy with the results of the 2020 election. And I would think that would embarrass an incoming administration. When we go to Afghanistan, I was a company commander in Afghanistan in 2002. I worked for General Flynn. I worked for General McChrystal. They weren't the door-kicking special operators at the time. They were members of the 18th Airborne Corps. And we had a simple mission: intel, target bad guys, kill bad guys. And then, of course, as you grow these missions and you start to develop militaries, you put US service members at risk. There's penetration. I did study Arabic, but I'm not, you can speak Arabic right past me because I won't understand a nuance. I won't understand a slang term. I won't understand, when you want to get past me in Arabic, you can do it because it's pretty easy to do, because I studied classical Arabic. Our operators on the ground don't speak the language. They're being talked past in the language. They're being taken advantage. They believe they're working with partners and they're not. It's not their fault. It's just that we haven't put a lot of stock in getting the right people in the right positions based on their backgrounds. You know, putting a tall gringo Texan in Iraq to be a spy doesn't really work. And you know, I was found out pretty quick. Yes, I worked in the Office of the Commander-in-Chief. I was an advisor to Prime Minister Maliki's Office of the Commander-in-Chief, but I was there as an intel officer. And they knew that. You know, they'll ask you, are you an intelligence officer? Or you work for the CIA? And you say, no. And they say, oh, okay, so you do work for the CIA. So anyway, it's an interesting place. Iraq, Afghanistan. There are people looking for American continuity, for American strength, and they've actually been very disappointed. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where an Iraqi official has told me, there are 2 other guys who were here this week asking me the same questions, and you don't even know who they are. And you literally sit there and realize that this Iraqi is being approached by 3 separate lines of engagement for 3 separate issues. And he's wondering, how are you a superpower? How do you have a plan? How do you have a strategy? And they take advantage of it. The ISIS campaign, real quick, if we look at it, it grew Qasem Soleimani's strength. It grew primacy for the Iraqi militias. And it ensured that 10-year-old Americans will be going back to Iraq 10 years from now to fight the 10-year-old Sunnis that were devastated, lost parents, lost everything in Mosul, Ramadi, Tikrit, and these other places where we threw out the counterinsurgency of 2007 and replaced it with an air campaign where militia members wearing Iraqi army uniforms told us where to drop steel on targets. For every 1 ISIS fighter killed in Mosul, there's about 60 civilians killed. And we can't conduct counterinsurgency like that because the Iraqis affected by that 10 years from now will remember that, and we'll have moved past it. And it leads me to one of the things I'm going to write a book on at some point, and some point meaning over the next year, is can democracies win wars anymore? And you know, we have these forever wars again because the institutional knowledge leaves the military and goes into the think tank community, leaves the military and goes into the lobbying community. It leaves the military to where a new commander coming into the theater in Iraq or Afghanistan, at the beginning of the ISIS campaign in Iraq, for example, we asked members of the 82nd Airborne Division that were getting ready to go there to be the first US boots on the ground, how many of you have been to Iraq before? And the only people that raised their hands were the senior leadership. That meant that a whole new group of Americans are going to be reintroduced to Shia militias, get reintroduced to Iraqi politicians who had developed a playbook. And if you don't become their baseline of knowledge, if you get there too late, you end up failing these soldiers. And they end up empowering the very accelerants of security degradation that you're trying to stop. It's counter, everything just works backwards. The counterinsurgency strategy becomes a counter-success strategy. And the people trying to keep us in Iraq and keep us in Afghanistan are no longer solution-based military guys. Yeah, sure, you have a General Keane or a General Petraeus say, we can't leave Afghanistan because there'll be a security void. But the enlisted ranks are saying, we don't have a strategy to win. So why are we here? But the most disappointing thing are the people in think tank communities that have business interests in these countries, that tout themselves as experts, testify as experts, and brief military officers that they should stay the course and continue. And worse, that the people like Mike Pregent say are bad actors really aren't. And that's why I'm in this fight. That's why I stay engaged with Iraq and Iran and places where I watch people with business interests testify and tell our government what to do. And I think That's one of our biggest problems. We have forever wars because the people telling us to stay in those wars they have financial benefits. This is not me making something up. This is factual. The institutional knowledge is outside. It's not inside the military, inside the intelligence community. It's outside. And I guess I can stop there, Shoshana, and take questions. I know that's a lot, probably all over the place, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
You could stop whenever you're ready, Michael. We have questions waiting for you. Someone wrote, alliances without a clear political purpose become ends and not means. They increase risk by widening potential commitments without the gain of focused and coordinated action to constrain opponents. So the question is that what we have with armies like the Lebanese armed forces, the Afghan army, the Iraqi armed forces? None of them share our long-term values. Even if they share our immediate security concerns, some of them do, some of them don't. Once you've got them, how do you get rid of them?
Well, we have to have, one of the biggest problems we have is people don't want to admit failure. People in government don't want to admit failure. I never met an American general or an Iraqi general that's ever said, things really got worse on my watch. So the argument for the LAF, the Lebanese armed forces, the argument for the Iraqi army, the argument for the Afghan army, is we're building institutions to counter something. We're building institutions to counter Iran and Lebanon and Iraq. And we're building institutions in Afghanistan to counter the Taliban. And those institutions get co-opted, again, because of this playbook. They know how to tell Americans new to this arena, this is very difficult what you're asking me to do. I need more money, I need more time. And the American always says, of course, we're here to support you. And that gives that adversary or that partner in quotations another year of status quo responses. Iran is great at co-opting our institutions. They use the Badr Corps success in Iraq to build the Lebanese armed forces model in Lebanon. And they use the Lebanese Hezbollah model in Lebanon to build the Iraqi militias inside of Iraq. All the while being the same experts in Lebanon and Iraq and being introduced to brand new Americans. The title of expert is so easily given in our intelligence community. As soon as you sit in the seat, you become the expert, the subject matter expert. Real quick, when I got to Iraq, they said, are you the subject matter expert for the Iraqi security forces? I said, no. I go, no, you are the subject matter expert for the Iraqi security forces. I said, okay, I guess I am. I'll at least, fake it till you make it, right? And I guess I finally got there.
So someone is listening to you and says, when I served in Vietnam, one US senator suggested that we declare victory and leave. What is your reaction to that approach? Well,
it goes back to that thesis statement, can democracies win wars? They can in 2-year increments. If we just said we're going to win a war in 2 years and just do everything we can while we have a consistent foreign policy, the president has political capital, the military is engaged, and then define those objectives in those first 2 years, you can make that statement. But you can't do that and then continue and change the mission and have mission creep and do all these things. Saddam's military was defeated when the president said the end of major combat operations are over against Saddam's military is what the next sentence or the next line should have been, because then it turned into an insurgency. And those of us that were in uniform, intelligence officers said, oh, we have no idea what we're getting ready to get into. There was going to be an insurgency. We're driving around in a city of 8 million people, and we are in soft armored Humvees, and we are a target. There are opportunists there. Iran flooded Iraq with Badr Corps militiamen the moment we invaded. And we made a simple calculation. Who hates Iran as much as we do? Or who hates Saddam as much as we do? And it was the Iranians. And these Iraqi militias said, we're here. And we fall for it every time. You put a suit on, you speak English, and you say you're against Saddam, you become an instant ally of the United States.
So you mentioned General Austin. General Austin, former CENTCOM commander, is now named as Joe Biden's pick for Secretary of Defense. He was a leading proponent of funding the Syrian radicals who actually became part of ISIS or were part of ISIS in the guise of the Free Syrian Army. What does that suggest to you about his likely policies in the region as Secretary of Defense as opposed to CENTCOM commander?
Yeah, so that is a, so he was looking at the 2007 surge where we built up the Sunni resistance against Al-Qaeda, the Sons of Iraq, the Awakening, or the Sahwa. You can't do that in a light way. And that's what General Austin was recommending in Syria. We vetted the people that we used for the Sons of Iraq and the Awakening. Yes, some of them were former Al-Qaeda. Yes, some of them were bad guys, but we vetted them. We met with them. We got the purple thumbprint where if somebody in your tribe commits terrorism, we're going to hold you responsible. And we had the Iraqis tell them that. What General Nagat and General Austin were trying to do in Syria. So if Austin was trying to bring in those bad actors and make it part of a resistance to Assad, you're right. They were part of Jabhat al-Nusra and they were part of what became ISIS, Daesh. But then the extreme tilt away from what General Austin was trying to do was Obama and Ben Rhodes and others telling General Allen and General Nagat, Special Operations General, that you can't have anybody who has any fighting experience be part of this. Only farmers, basically people that don't know how to fight can be part of this force. So they ended up spending a lot of money, and I don't know if you remember, but only 10 people got reintroduced to the battlefield that met the criteria. And as soon as they came in, they were met with armed people, and they gave up their equipment, and they basically were killed or went into the shadows. So those policies don't work when you try to do them on the cheap. Those policies don't work when you don't build strong alliances. And to that earlier question about allies, we have given our allies so many examples of betrayal in Iraq, in Syria, that it's really hard for the future special operator to be in Iraq and Syria and say, hey, trust me, I want to work with you against Assad, or I want to work with you against ISIS, or work with you against the militias, when they're going to say, wait a minute, I've heard this 3 times now, and each time we've been abandoned, whether it was the Kurds in Syria, the Kurdish referendum of 2017 in Iraq, or the Sunni awakening that we basically abandoned and allowed Maliki and the militias to target them, to kill them, and then leave them vulnerable for ISIS and Al-Qaeda to do the same thing as reprisal attacks when ISIS rolled back into Iraq. So we have a terrible record on this. And where this was worse, unfortunately, these are the same people being elevated by the Biden administration to take on bigger challenges like Russia and China. Same individuals being elevated to the national security stage are the same individuals that ignored the rise of ISIS, ignored the rise of the militias, were for the Iran deal, whilst downplaying Qasem Soleimani's rising influence and downplaying and denying the existence of the land bridge from Tehran to Damascus to Beirut. Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut.
So you mentioned the Kurds. We had several people send in questions about the Kurds. What's our current relationship? And how can we work with them in the future, talking about people that we have not done well by? What do we do with the Kurds? How do we restore ourselves, or is that impossible?
It's every American that promises the Kurds that they're there to help means it. The problem is the next American that comes in promises something different or reneges on a promise. We've lost the Kurds of northern Iraq this way. We can't get the PUK and the KDP to agree on anything. The PUK is heavily influenced by Ismail Khani and Qasem Soleimani. They border Iran. There's a lot of pressure on them. Baghdad, favors them over the KDP, over the Barzani KDP. And absent a U.S. wall behind you as an Iraqi Kurd or a Syrian Kurd, you're left very vulnerable. And you're left to make choices that will keep your leverage in this country. And that's why we see a tilt, unfortunately, towards Russia in northern Iraq when it comes to gas and oil. When it comes to protections in northern Syria, you have the Kurds now hedging bets, trying to work with Assad and Russia against Erdogan, a NATO ally in Turkey. And the US will have one policy in Iraq and a completely different policy in Syria. Yet our adversaries look at Iraq and Syria as the same place and have a consistent strategy across both theaters. And that's the problem the US doesn't get, that they are playing chess with the people that invented the game.
That is.
Oh, you wanted me to be positive. I'm sorry.
No, that's only for the last question. We'll get to the last question in a few minutes, and then you can be positive. You wrote recently that there is support for the United States among various groups in Iraq.
Yes.
People who want US support, people who see us as their future. And that some of those people would actually like to see us cut off the funds to the Iraqi government, because that is the problem. Can you address the difference between the Iraqi people and their government on this?
Oh, absolutely. This is the first time in our Iraq campaign where 80% of the country is willing to forgive our mistakes and tell us how to do it right. And this includes the Shia population of Iraq. The Shia youth, the population under the age of 30, and Iraq's population, 70% of it is under the age of 30. Whether they're a Sunni military-aged male, a Sunni female going to college, a Shia female going to college, a Shia unemployed military-aged male, and that's a military term. That means somebody of fighting age. They are against their government and willing to die for simple things. They're not asking for, things that we have here in the West, like free college and canceling rent. They're asking for electricity, water, internet, human rights, and they get punished. If the government wants to punish a population, they'll turn off the electricity. They'll shut down the water. They'll turn off the internet, and then they'll go kill influencers. And Qasem Soleimani chaired a meeting in Baghdad before he was targeted by the US and said, hey, this is what you need to do. Shut off the internet and kill all the influencers. That's what we do in our country. So this is the first time in our campaign where 80% of the Iraqis are saying, we'll forgive you, we'll tell you how to do it right. And all we have to do is say no to the designated terrorists that the United States has designated that have a controlling political bloc in the Council of Representatives that decide Iraq's laws. I don't know how we can designate individuals that are in that group and then not designate the whole group and keep US money from going to it. And these designated terrorists get an Iraqi paycheck. They have an Iraqi government ID. And their existence in the Iraqi government, they are violations of the Magnitsky Act, violations of the Leahy Law, and we're not doing anything about it because it's too complex. And something I say in my panels is we don't do difficult and we do easy wrong. And we just keep doing that in Iraq.
That's scary. But what you just said sounds very much like what we understand about Iran as well. The distinction between the Iranian people and the Iranian government. We don't read about it in terms of Iraq at all because nobody cares about Iraq right now in the media. Nobody brings it to us. There's a little bit of it on Iran, but are the two similar in position, or is it necessary to have a change of government in Iraq first so that in Iran first, so that you can get to these other things?
We could have major influence on this existing government in Baghdad without having the regime collapse in Tehran. The argument on the other side is, well, they're neighbors. Of course, Iran has influence inside of Iraq. And I say, well, the Islamic Republic of Canada doesn't pick our president. The Islamic Republic of Mexico doesn't have primacy over our security forces. It doesn't steal our resources. Iraq is bordered by 7 nations. But what's consistent is the Iranian people and the Iraqi people have the same message. They want the regime to go away. They want the regime out in Iraq. It's the chant of Iraq Hurra, Iran Bara. Iran, get out. Iraq is liberated, Iran, get out. And they are connected. So the regime demonstrates capabilities by showing what they can do in Iraq with impunity, by shooting protesters in the face. They demonstrate to their Shia Persian base that look what we can do to our Sunni Arab base here in Iran with impunity. Look what we could do to our Kurdish base in Iran with impunity. Ismail Khani rose to fame by executing every military-age male in 3 of Iran's Kurdish provinces after the revolution. That's the new Quds Force commander. That's the commander that has pressure over the Kurds in Iraq. So they're together. A lot of Iraqis have said, you need to separate Iraq from Iran. And I pushed back. So who has more influence in your country, Iraqis or Tehran? And they'll admittedly say Tehran does. One of the things about the fall of the Soviet Union, you could see it in music, you could see it in poetry if you're paying attention, you could see it in the things that were happening in the underground culture. Those things are happening in Iran right now. Those things are happening in Iraq right now. And all it needs is the international spotlight that this 24/7 media could put in place if we didn't politicize everything in this world.
Interesting thought, because we think we know where we want to go. We think we know where the people want to go. How do we get there? And I think you may be right that turning a spotlight on those people would help us get there.
Imagine an Anderson Cooper in Tehran, or an Anderson Cooper in Baghdad.
Do we have to let him come home?
What's that?
Never mind. I didn't say that.
But that doesn't happen. It needs to be, the media should care. I mean, that's why we have the Leahy Law and Magnitsky Act is in place to protect these individuals from being killed by their governments if the US is somehow providing any financial support to these governments. That's the case in Iraq, and we're ignoring it. And it's very clear and evident to the Iraqis that the United States is choosing Shia political parties tied to Tehran over the Iraqi people. And they may get another 4 years, meaning the Quds Force, Tehran has another 4 years to take what's left of Iraq's sovereignty away. And it'll be under our watch.
Let's move, not like we couldn't spend 5 hours on this, but let's move to one more thing before we
Sure.
run out of time. I want to go to Afghanistan,
Sure.
which is sort of where you started. We've been in Afghanistan for 19 years. We've spent a fortune, and we've spent a lot of young American lives. And we haven't been very successful. There are those who argue that because we're there, we are allowing another generation of Afghans to grow up who will be better, who will be less corrupt, who will be more amenable to the ways of the West. And that forcing them to negotiate with the Taliban is a mistake. There are other people who argue that it's a civil war, it's their war. We're not going to kill all the Taliban. So we ought to get out because all we're doing is prolonging the war. What are we doing in Afghanistan?
We are keeping the technocrats and those people that we hope will someday turn this country around in the country by being there. And what's sad is if we left, they'd leave too.
You mean Democrats, Afghan Democrats? You're not talking about American.
Well, I'm talking about Afghan technocrats.
Okay, no, I just want to be clear that we're not talking about Democrats on Capitol Hill. We're talking about Afghan people.
We're talking about Afghan technocrats. We're talking about the Afghans that need us to be there, but need us to develop a strategy and not force these quick fixes. Now, saying a quick fix about a 19-year war, I know it sounds very contradictory, but to force them to negotiate with an adversary the way we are, and having that adversary not even worried about repercussions, these things aren't lasting. The Taliban will gain control of Afghanistan under a Biden administration. They already have control of Afghanistan under a Trump administration. What I mean by control is we're sitting across the table from them. We are treating them like a legitimate political party instead of, and this is built for Democrat condemnation. They are against women going to school, reading. They should be a magnet for every Democrat who cares about human rights, and for every American. But again, we politicized it with whataboutism. If I mention Afghanistan, they go straight to Saudi Arabia. If I mention Iran, they go straight to Saudi Arabia. Like, why can't we talk about all three in separate ways? So, what are we doing in Afghanistan? The argument is if we have to stay in order to keep it from becoming a training camp for ISIS, Al Qaeda, and the Taliban. Well, we can keep it from becoming those places by simply using imagery and targeting them when they do these things. So this is almost like the Biden plan in Iraq. And the Biden plan of Afghanistan was, let's use intel and special operators and decimate a terrorist army. We can do that. The problem is we believe we can build an institution to counter these things. And these institutions get co-opted because there's no consistency in US foreign policy. If I had a kid that was getting ready to go to Afghanistan, the US military, there's no strategy to win. There's no strategy to win. It's keep your head down while you're there, try not to die. And that's no way for an American military operation or a campaign to be viewed. And it's so evident by our enlisted people that are still joining the military and an all volunteer military, knowing that if you join the Army or the Marine Corps, you're going to Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, and they're still joining. We owe them the leadership, and we want to gain their confidence by giving them a strategy to win, or basically saying, we're going to pull out and we're going to just conduct a special ops intel war. And we could do that. The problem is Afghanistan would just turn into that black hole where everybody gets to go there. And so it could be a free fire zone. That's something you've heard the Trump administration mention. And that's not, I'm not advocating for that position, but you can kill terrorists using intel, satellites, and special ops. And Afghanistan will continue to be that place.
So what would the beginning of an Afghan strategy look like? I know we're not going to have time to get to the end of a strategy here.
You know, the interesting thing is when General Flynn was in charge of developing this plan, it was called the All Hands Plan. It was an American volunteer that would serve a 5-year commitment in Afghanistan. Would become a language expert, culture expert. 5 years would look like, 6 months in country, 3 months back for specialized training, briefings, testifying, making policymakers smart, and then going back and continuing to reintroduce the same people to the same Afghans. What Mattis did in Anbar and General Allen, and they should be credited for this, is they would introduce an Iraqi tribal sheikh to 3 Americans. One American would be there for 7 months. The next American would be the one that followed him, and the next American would follow that person. And each time one of those individuals was getting ready to be replaced, all 3 would come back again. So the tribal sheikh would sit down with the same 3 people over the course of 21 months. And that took Anbar from a dangerous red category in Iraq to a green category, meaning we had developed allies. And that's where the Sunni awakening rose from. You can do that in Afghanistan. The problem is I know officers that went there to Afghanistan on the five hands program or the all hands program. And they were told by a senior officer, I don't care if you're part of this plan, you're a major, and I need you to build PowerPoint slides on Afghan's energy sector. And they took the talent, they demoralized the talent, and the talent said, I'm going to go do something else. So consistent strategy with volunteers that want to be there in something like a 2-year to 5-year capacity where we have a defined 2-year goal and a committed 5-year goal. This has to happen in consecutive terms for a president. We had 4 more years of a Trump doctrine in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, the regime would collapse. But now the regime will likely get a reprieve from the Biden administration, based on what I'm hearing Tony Blinken say, based on what I'm hearing Jake Sullivan say, based on what you're not hearing from the Biden campaign, or Biden himself, or Kamala Harris.
So to our listeners, I had said to Michael Pregent that when we come toward the end of this program, I was going to ask him a last question. And I was going to hope that the answer to the last question was something positive and uplifting so that you all would leave with something positive and uplifting. I'm sorry to say that I failed because my last question is not going to induce a positive response, I don't think. The last question I have for the moment, see if something else comes in. Do both American political parties and both sides of the American political divide have constituencies that benefit from forever wars? Is that one of the things that keeps us from figuring out how to get out of them? Are we benefiting?
Absolutely. There are sectors that are benefiting from forever wars. And I'm not talking about the military contracting, the military weapon contractors. We could talk about that. That could be a Russia and China conversation. Right. But when it comes to, you literally have people in the think tank community that have businesses in Iraq working strategic communications with the very politicians tied to Tehran, yet advocating a position here in the United States to stay engaged and dismiss and downplay the role of these politicians that are actually paying them. And that should shock a lot of people. I'm talking to some people about starting a veterans organization of former intel and special operators and people that have worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, Veterans Against Forever Wars. And it's going to be based on this. It's like, listen, we can't stay in a war because somebody from this think tank said we should, when all of this evidence here says the person that they're advocating for has committed human rights violations, is a designated terrorist, and is working against US policies. And that's what's happening. And I'm very comfortable saying that. Oh, and to be positive, we're going to start that organization, and we're going to name these people so we can end these forever wars, or at least their role in continuing them.
So the listeners actually have provided the uplift. We have several people, Michael, who said that this was a very important and a very useful and a very necessary conversation. So we'll let them do it. But I'm still going to go for that down note at the end. This time I can't help it. One of our listeners asks, it seems that the region has become more dangerous since Saddam was removed in 2003. Is that true? Or are we just moving along a continuum, and even without the Iraq war, we would still be facing a lot of these issues today?
You know, the Iraq war, I get asked this a lot about the Iraq war, and I say I can't do time travel foreign policy and go back and fix that. We have to deal with the contemporary environment, and this was always Iran's design. The Badr Corps was built in Iraq to take out Saddam Hussein. It was going to happen at some point. The Badr Corps was built to give Iraq to Iran to ensure that Iraq would never be a threat to Iran again. And we tried to get the Badr Corps sanctioned last week. And it was a Republican staff member for a Republican senator that killed it. Because these people that I'm talking about said, no, Badr Corps is necessary. We can't designate Iran's premier proxy in Iraq because it would tear apart the whole system. And my argument is that's why you designate them. You tear them out of it. It's not like they're the Ba'athists. You don't have to be a Badr Corps member to be a teacher or to be a doctor or to be, in government. All you have to do is swear allegiance to Tehran to be a Badr Corps member. And to have that entity become a hands-off entity is one of the biggest mistakes we're making in Iraq. Every attack against the Americans, every attack against our US Embassy last year was facilitated by the Badr Corps because they control the terrain and they wear the uniforms of top generals in the Iraqi army. And we can't even do that. And a Republican staffer did that.
So so this is not, now here's a positive note. This is not simply divided between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. Perhaps we will get some wise thinkers from both parties.
Well, the good thing about General Austin is Austin will kill the Mattis holdovers in the Department of Defense, because it's the Mattis holdovers and Mattis's influence on them in the Pentagon that are telling Republicans and their staffers that we've got to be hands off when it comes to Iran, its militias, and the Badr Corps, because we don't want to create a larger problem in the Middle East. And all it does is accelerate a larger problem in the Middle East when it comes to Tehran. When they see a green light, they take it. And they're looking at the next 4 years as a green light. The good thing is we'll be in the way of it. We'll be out here talking about it every day.
That is good news. And on behalf of our listeners, I want to thank you for what I agree with them. This has been a terrific presentation about a very important, very overlooked part of American foreign policy. Michael Pregent, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.